This conference will now be recorded.
All right, folks. So this is, we're looking at the nervous system today. Next week, we will also be looking at special senses, the sensory portion of the nervous system. But today, we're going to be focusing on the brain. Okay? Today, we're focusing on the brain. And this is a Word document that I've posted that you'll see here for lab practical, lab quiz. Really, it's a quiz. Lab quiz number 2 will be on the nervous system, the brain, the special senses next week, and then we'll also be looking at the cardiovascular system, okay? So we'll be looking at these different structures each week and talking about them. This week we're going to be looking at the brain. And so we have these structures here that I would like you to be able to identify. I'm going to give you also one page, it's about 3 pages of some images that I'm going to be going over with you now. And on the last page, you'll see that you'll have the opportunity to actually fill in the blanks of where we have the lines going to the different parts of the longitudinal, the sagittal view of the head, which will include the neurological components that I would like you to know. Okay, so let's see here as far as these different terms and such, and I'll point them out to you as we go over things here. So a gyrus would be one of the folds that we would see within the cerebral hemispheres. So as you look at the cerebral hemispheres in just a moment, you're going to notice that there's going to be these little folds that will be throughout the cerebral hemispheres, and we're going to see that they're called, one is called a gyrus, multiple, plural, would be a gyri. And the sulcus would be the indentations between the individual gyri, okay? The longitudinal fissure is a very deep indentation, right? The sulcus would be a mild indentation. The longitudinal fissure would be the deep fissure between, the deep indentation between, separating the two cerebral hemispheres. So we'll look at that also there. And the cerebral hemispheres, we'll see that in just a moment. So let's, and actually, you know what? I don't have in the image here, but I would like to show you. Let's do that right now. Is we're going to look at the all right, so the cerebral hemisphere, so this is a good image here that I would like to show you here. So as we're looking at the hemispheres here, and we're looking at, this would be the anterior, the forward, the front portion, right, of the brain. And here would be the occipital region, would be the back portion of the brain. As we're looking from superior to inferior, from above to down below, we're looking at and seeing how we have the frontal lobe very large in comparison to the rest of the remaining portions of the cerebral hemispheres. So you'll see we have these gyri, these folds, and we have these indentations, these sulci, or sulcus singular, or a gyrus singular. And we have this longitudinal fissure, which helps to separate the cerebral hemispheres from each other. Okay, so you'll see that and then there's a connection between them, which is called the corpus callosum, that we'll notice in a few minutes there as I show you the image that I have prepared for you all. I want you to see something here that's quite interesting, is that you'll notice that the frontal lobe really is an area where this is primarily what makes you, who you are, the person that you are, how you act and behave and what you are. That's your frontal lobe, a good portion of it, okay? And not only just that, but a good portion of it as far as like how you present yourself to all and to the society is frontal lobe. How you actually control your actions of your body, your muscles, and which will again move your bones and such, that's frontal lobe, okay? So this has a lot to do with really control of the body and control of thought, really would be the frontal lobe. When we get to, and really right here, if you see that there's, see this gyrus right here? This gyrus right here is called the motor gyrus, right? The motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. So that's really the area right here, very important, that this area will help to really control what takes place within the skeletal muscle, the somatic nervous system, okay? This central sulcus is the line of demarcation. You see that groove there, right? That would be the demarcation between frontal lobe and parietal lobe, because then in the on the parietal lobe right here, This would be the post-central gyrus, right in through in here, and this would be your sensory cortex. So we're taking in sensory information and we're processing that sensory information that is being brought to the brain. We're going to see the pathways which will take place as far as what it'll travel, as far as the brainstem and such, and pass through the midbrain. So we'll look at that. So think sensory input and processing it in through in here. Occipital lobe, which if you were to take your hand and just touch at the base of your skull, really deep within would be the occipital lobe. And this is where visual processing takes place. So when you take in any type of visual input from around the world that you're in, that will be processed in the occipital lobe, okay? We call that your visual cortex. So let's take a look now at the images that I have for you all here. So I've provided a few images for you here. Now, as we look at this first image here, what we're looking at is we have a right cerebral hemisphere, because this would be anterior, this would be posterior. So what we're looking at there is we've removed the left cerebral hemisphere, and now we're just looking at the right cerebral hemisphere. Let me shut off my email. There we go. Okay, so we're just looking at that. And then what we'll see here is that we're looking at a very important area that we'll talk about in just a couple minutes there. But I wanted to point this out to you and show you this image because I just like how you're seeing here where it talks about the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So what happens, folks, is that the spinal cord is down and through in here that you're not seeing, and the spinal cord will take information, sensory input, and it will pass through this area right here, pass through what's called the thalamus, okay? The thalamus is in this region right here in the third ventricle, and the thalamus is really what we would say the sensory relay center that takes the information and sends it where it needs to go, okay? Where it can be processed further by your cerebral cortex of the cerebral hemispheres, okay? So in the case of, say, visual input, that would be here in the occipital lobe. In the case of auditory input, that would be really in the temporal lobe that you're not seeing in this view, okay? So just so that you have an idea as far as input coming through here. How about output? Output is also going through here, passing through this area here. So the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, very important as far as then also taking the efferent information, EFF, ERENT, information to the body and sending it out, passing through there, okay? So let's now go to next image here. And what we're seeing, folks, is that we have, again, it's a right cerebral hemisphere. So we have the anterior, we have the posterior, the front, we have the back. We've removed the left side, and now we're left with what's going on as far as within the right cerebral hemisphere. So here we would have this right cerebral hemisphere. This is called the Cingulate Gyrus right here, and it's superior to this area called the corpus callosum. Now, I didn't ask you to give me the Cingulate Gyrus, but just know that that's there, and that aids in issues going on with processing and also acting as a conduit for information going to the different areas of the cerebral cortex of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, you'll see here as far as this Cingulate Gyrus, this corpus callosum is really the connector between the cerebral hemispheres. Sometimes what they'll do in the case of patients who are dealing with issues with epilepsy and epileptic seizures, and they cannot stop the seizures, sometimes they'll actually sever the connection between the cerebral hemispheres, and that can stop the seizures. Sometimes what they can do in a very drastic way, if there is a case of, I'm forgetting the name of the pathology, White's? No, it'll come to me. So they'll actually remove a cerebral hemisphere for a child. This is for a young person who their brain is just having an electrical storm of neurological activity and causing seizures to take place. They'll actually remove one cerebral hemisphere, okay? And as such, what they'll do is the other cerebral hemisphere, because the child is young enough, the child will be able to still function, and that other side of the brain will be able to cover for the side that's been missing. And that space area there will be replaced with cerebral spinal fluid, so that it's not just a space, but it's a space with fluid present within. I believe it's Rasmussen syndrome I'm almost positive that's what the term is, Rasmussen syndrome. And so they have to do this early on in a child's life because the brain has what's called plasticity, the ability for it to actually adapt, and other areas of the brain take over for what's been missing or been damaged. Quite fascinating. So that corpus callosum is a very important connection between the cerebral hemispheres. And know that the right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body, left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of the body. Okay, so quite fascinating how there's a crossing over of fibers and communication at this corpus callosum. What we have here next is this area here, this in yellow. This is called the third ventricle. And this is a space. This is a space that will contain cerebral spinal fluid. And within this space, there will be the area here called the thalamus, right in through in here. And then kind of anterior and inferior below would be this space in through in here called the hypothalamus. Now, they don't look like a whole lot, right? They're pretty small, right? But yet the thalamus is really the relay center upon which all sensory input, except for your sense of smell, pass through. So information, sensory input passing through here will have to go through the thalamus, except for, again, like I said, your sense of smell. And then it will be then routed to the areas of the cortex in order to be processed further. And so that you have then the perception that you are actually seeing something or you're actually hearing something. That's as a result of passing through the thalamus and going to the cortex. So the cortex of the cerebral hemispheres, very important, folks, very important. So we have here also, I want to point out to you, this structure right here is called the pituitary gland. So when we're discussing the endocrine system, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland have a very strong control over what takes place as far as the hormones that are released throughout the body. Very important. Then we get to, and I'm not going to ask this for you on your list of terms and such, but this area right here is called the pineal gland, aka the pineal body. And this is the area where we actually are releasing melatonin, which will help us to calm us at night. When it becomes dark outside, your body, your natural rhythm of the body would be to, oh, getting dark outside, it's time for sleep. And so that area of the body, the pineal gland, releases melatonin, which helps to calm down the body and helps to make you more relaxed prior to going to bed. Now, some people, again, I've mentioned this before there, that they'll take melatonin as a sleep supplement, and it will help them to be calm so that they can get some peaceful rest. You'll see here, as far as you can view the occipital lobe, or one portion of it, and this is where we have the visual input, as I said before, that comes into, passes through thalamus and then goes to the occipital lobe, and that information is processed in the occipital lobe. Inferior to that there is one half of the cerebellum. This is a very important structure for your balance and equilibrium, as well as also processing thoughts. Also the cerebellum is also involved in that, as well as the frontal lobe. You'll see here the white matter, and then there's a grayish color, right? So these tissues, whether they're white or gray matter, the gray matter does not have the insulating myelin that the white matter has. So as you can probably look at the computer that you're sitting at right now. So I have cables. So I have a cable here for my Ethernet cable. I have a power cord cable right here, right? Well, they're insulated, they're covered. Well, myelin is that covering that insulates nerves, and not all the nerves, but a good portion of the nerves. And so it allows for very fast communication. And so that white matter you see here, that's covered in this myelin substance. And so if someone has multiple sclerosis, they're suffering from a demyelinating disorder. And that can lead to a whole lot of symptoms and discomfort. And maybe multiple sclerosis is something that you might want to choose for your paper, your mini paper coming up, and learn more about that. Now, you'll see here also that we have this third ventricle containing the thalamus, containing the hypothalamus. Then we have this cerebral aqueduct, this tube, this connection to the fourth ventricle right here, anterior to the cerebellum. And then this will then move down, and so cerebral spinal fluid is produced, and circulating throughout, covering and in throughout the neurological, the nervous tissue. Okay, very important, that cerebrospinal fluid. Now you'll see here that we have the midbrain, and cerebral peduncles is the proper term, but you just need to know it's the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then distal to this, more inferior word, would be the spinal cord. Okay, so you'll have a list of structures here that you'll have to identify. I put in for you here on your list here the sutures and such, so that just so that you can have an idea as far as lines of demarcation in the skull, and then looking at the nervous structures themselves deep within the skull. So how it correlates as far as the bones and the actual tissue that's deep within and underneath of the skull. Okay. I have for you here. So here, if you're looking at this image here, so here you're just looking at the lobes, and you're not looking at the insular lobe, which would be really deep within here. If we were to peel away those gyri, okay, we would actually see the insula. And the insula, if you don't recall, I mentioned that that is involved in, quite possibly, we believe that it's involved in addiction. And in particular, we've seen that folks that have, patients that have experienced some type of trauma to the insula, or actually as a result of a tumor and having had a surgical procedure to remove a portion or all of a good amount of tissue from the insula, patients that were addicted to smoking and many packs per day didn't seem to have any desire to want to smoke anymore after having some type of input as far as removal of the insula or damage to the insula. So quite interesting. So we have here the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And you're seeing here that we have these gyri, right? Gyri, these folds. We have these indentations, these sulcus or sulci, plural. We have this central sulcus right here. We have the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus. Here in red would be, this would be for your motor function, so actually conscious control of what takes place within your body as far as moving your arms, your legs, moving your body. That's conscious control. That would be that motor cortex here. This would be the sensory cortex for taking information and processing it. And again, too, sensory information coming to the thalamus, passing through, and then going to the cortex. The occipital lobe we talked about for vision. We talked about here for sense of hearing. We also have sense of taste in through this area. We have also processing for your speech, as far as right in through in here and back in through in here, listening to speech, producing speech, right in through in there. So the lobe's very, very important, and really who you are as a person. Really, it's the frontal lobe that really your personality and who you are and how you really, a lot of what you're doing as far as processing and thinking, in addition to the cerebellum right there. So here is that image, folks, that I would like you all to have the opportunity to fill in, just put next to the lines here what the structures are, okay? So you can fill in as many of them as you can, okay? There's more there than what I've given you, okay? So you'll see on your Word document, right, that I've given you a certain amount of terms that you'll have. And again, too, the sutures, don't worry about the sutures as far, you're not going to see a suture here, sutures on bone, but the sutures are there. I just put them in there as far as the terms, just so that you're thinking as far as, well, what's deep within the skull bones as far as in through those areas there, and the separation of the bones. So there's also a separation of the neurological tissue through there. And that's why I put that there. So it's not that you're going to identify it on what you're seeing right now, but just when you look at the bones, when you look at a skull, and see where those sutures are, those lines of demarcation between the bones of the skull, you can understand that, well, deep and beneath those bones are the different areas of brain, okay? So that's it there for you, folks. So this is part of your assignment as far as to just fill in this page for me, please. So you just have to send in this page, okay, to me as far as for the assignment. It's due next week, a week from today. So you'll have this to do for me, as well as the mini paper. Okay.
Next week. Due next week.
That's due next week, next Thursday, okay?
Thanks, bye, thanks.
Very good. Okay, so let me now stop recording here.